This is Mike Tatarski, host of the Vietnam Weekly podcast and author of the Vietnam Weekly newsletter, coming to you from Ho Chi Minh City for the first time in a few weeks again. What is the first industry that comes to mind when you think of reducing carbon emissions? Perhaps transportation, shipping, heavy manufacturing sectors, or maybe agriculture, all of which are huge, of course. It might take you a while for you to reach the apparel industry, which accounts for about 2% of global emissions, if we're strictly talking about manufacturing, though you may find higher figures depending on the source. 2% may not sound like a lot, but that's roughly equivalent to the annual emissions of Japan or Germany. So while apparel manufacturing doesn't get anywhere near the attention of, let's say, shifting to electric vehicles or reducing energy use in residential buildings, electrifying more of this process would help address emission reductions in the equivalent of one of the world's largest economies. So what steps are being taken in this area? Today's guest is Pete Ford, Clean Heat Technical Lead at the Apparel Impact Institute, or AII. We discussed the most carbon-intensive aspects of apparel production, which is a huge industry here in Vietnam, the global goal of eliminating on-site coal from factories by 2030, Vietnam's advantages in embracing more sustainable manufacturing, and a factory in the country's north that is a world first in terms of electrification. As always, if you have any comments, feedback, or guest ideas, get in touch at matatarski@gmail.com. Let's get to my conversation with Pete. Pete, thanks so much for coming on the podcast.
Thanks, Mike. Long-time listener, first-time caller. I'm very happy to be here. Thank you.
Yeah, I mean, just for listeners to know, we're actually pretty good friends in real life as well. So, but it has been kind of in progress for the podcast for a while. So good to finally make it happen. So you've been doing a lot of work in Vietnam for a while. I mean, coming and going from Cambodia, I suppose. That we also don't have to only focus on Vietnam. But so within the garment industry, I know a lot of listeners will probably be obviously familiar that it's a big industry here in Vietnam, Cambodia as well, some other countries in the region, but maybe not kind of familiar with the emissions impact or the carbon intensity of the industry. What are some of the most intensive aspects of the garment manufacturing process?
So yeah, making fabric and making clothing and then shipping it around the world and everything else is about 2% of global carbon emissions, which is much smaller than agriculture or construction, but is clearly significant and is why I have a job trying to cut that number even more. So it keeps me very busy. Within that 2%, the vast majority of emissions is in the making of fabric, and specifically in the dyeing and processing of fabric. So turning cotton or synthetics into long threads and yarn, that is called tier 3 manufacturing. That is mostly electric, and therefore solar panels on the roof and green tariffs can reduce that carbon space. Making fabric, so turning that yarn into various fabrics, dyeing it, processing it, printing designs on it, all that stuff, that is where the energy is. Huge amounts of energy used primarily to make water hot. You need a lot of steam and you need a lot of hot water for that. So that's the main area of my work, and that's called tier 2 processing. And then cutting all of that fabric into pieces, sewing it together, putting it in boxes and sending it to the stores, that is tier 1. And again, that is quite heavily electric. And then smaller amounts of energy needed for steam to iron the clothing. You buy a nice t-shirt in the store that has been washed and ironed at the factory already. All of that emissions, all of that energy is within the work that I do. And so that's the global footprint. Hopefully that was interesting to someone. And at the Vietnamese level, Vietnam is home to primarily tier 1 and tier 2 manufacturing. So making the clothing and making the fabric. And with quite heavy, what's the word I'm looking for? Lean, let's go with lean, to synthetics and sportswear materials. So they need even more pressure and even more steam and even higher temperatures of water to dye and to process, meaning that Vietnamese factories have a relatively high energy footprint. And traditionally, most of this energy at the factory level has been met with coal burning coal at the factory to generate the hot water and the steam, and the grid electricity for the rest. But the industry has some quite big targets, and that includes no more coal. So big area of work, specifically in Vietnam, is to get this coal out of the factories, and really have a meaningful decarbonization impact.
Now that goal, is that like a goal the Vietnamese government has set, or is that company level, factory level?
Yeah, so originally it came from the industry. This is the UNFCCC fashion charter commitment to zero on-site coal by 2030. And this was a commitment signed by most of the world's biggest brands, about 200 or so, and increasingly some large factories as well, to replace the coal with lower carbon options, ideally with electricity, but that's a challenge I can explain later. And that was then the global reality. And then the Vietnamese government has stepped in, and has its own targets, under the carbon monitoring program that it's had for its largest emitters. There's a handful of Vietnamese factories that are included in that. So they have to monitor their emissions and have targets to cut those emissions. And the easiest on paper way of doing that is to remove your coal. So the industry's targets are aligning with the Vietnamese government targets, in a way that other countries don't have that partnership. In Cambodia, for example, the government is much less hands-on with how the factories are operated. In India is similar to Vietnam. In certain parts of the country, any factory in the Delhi region, for example, cannot burn coal anymore. So there are efforts happening around the world, but Vietnam is well positioned to be a leader in this space.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and we'll get to that. Now, when you say they're using on-site coal for these boilers, like I'm kind of picturing someone shoveling coal into an old steam train. Is it that simplistic, or is it slightly more advanced than that?
You'd be surprised. At smaller factories and older factories, it is that. There is normally one or two old men with shovels shoveling coal into a hatch on a big metal box that's very, very hot. That is still done. It feels remarkably Victorian, but no, that is still the case. Larger factories that just have much higher steam demand, and newer factories, this process can be automated with conveyor belts, but it still involves sometimes someone in a digging truck, like in construction equipment, shoveling coal onto a conveyor belt. So the process has just been modernized, but it's still the same thing.
Right.
And it's a remarkable experience walking around or walking into a factory's boiler area and seeing this again. It feels Victorian.
Sure, yeah.
I'm very happy to be finding solutions to that. So, yeah.
Yeah, I mean, on that note, I know I think a few weeks ago or something, you were in northern Vietnam. You shared some photos from a factory, or I think at least one factory that was going or had already gone fully electric, I believe, for this process. Can you share a bit about that?
Yes, certainly. So, in my previous life working for H&M Group, I was able to really drive electrification of factory processes with the great team that we had there. And that included one Chinese factory shifting to fully electric steam, using thermal storage as its medium. And yeah, this the world's first, and this got a lot of coverage, and it was really exciting. But the factory itself was really small. The amount of steam that it needed was really small. So it was more of a test case of proving the principle rather than seeing any impact. And so over the last few years, there have been more examples in China. And then really excitingly, this factory in northern Vietnam has shifted from burning biomass. So it was already post-coal, but it was still men throwing logs into a metal box. And that has now been replaced with 4 steam heat pumps, an expanded rooftop solar footprint, and 100% electric factory that does dyeing of synthetic fabrics. This is really exciting, and is both proof of concept, outside of China, which is always great, and I think should be and is proving to be motivational for similar factories across the world. I'm hearing a lot of questions, a lot of excitement. So it's really exciting to be involved in this, and that it's happened in Vietnam. So good job.
Yeah, I mean, you said this is Vietnam's kind of well placed for this shift. Why is that so?
Well, for a few reasons. One, the electricity grid connection, landscape across Vietnam is very good. Everyone has access to electricity. Factories have been well connected into the national grid since they were built. You can compare that to Bangladesh, where I lived for a year, and only about 50% of factories were even connected to the grid, regardless of how much electricity they were using. Half of the factories were burning gas on site to generate their own electricity, because the electricity system just was, or it still is, really not up to the needs of the industry. And so in Vietnam, that is already the case. We don't have to discuss transmission lines for factory connections. So that's far ahead. The excitement with which Vietnam understood rooftop solar starting 2019 onwards means that the factories, most of them already have full rooftop coverage of solar and are benefited for that for years. So that is another space where they're already on board, whereas other markets, India, Turkey, for example, factories are only now really installing rooftop solar. So Vietnam is already ahead there. And again, you've got this commitment from the Vietnamese government for the largest factories need to decarbonize, need to find a way to really improve. And the best long-term solution to that is electricity. It's the only thing that can be zero carbon. Yes, that might be through renewable energy certificates, which have their lovers and their haters, but is a globally accepted mechanism for that. And a topic that has dogged me my entire time with Vietnam, the DPPA, at some point, hopefully, while I'm still alive, will be utilized at the garment factory level to mean that the electricity is even easier to prove that it's renewable and electric. So all of these position Vietnam in a way away from some of its competitors. And Vietnamese factories are open to installing cutting edge technology or trying new ideas as well, which is also exciting and sets them apart from some of their competing nations as well. So I would say, I'm bullish on Vietnam's potential here. And that is supported by the evidence. We have this factory now in northern Vietnam. I've got interest from other factories across the country for similar ideas. So yeah, it's exciting times.
Now, you mentioned an acronym, the DPPA. I had an episode probably a couple years ago now where that was discussed, but could you just give a quick refresher on what that stands for and what it is?
Sure. So the DPPA, its official title for Vietnam, is slightly confusing because it stands for Direct Power Purchase Agreement. However, the Vietnamese mechanism is not a direct power purchase agreement. But anyway, what it basically means is a factory or an industrial zone can sign a long-term contract with a wind farm or a solar farm or a series of them, and agree on a price for green electricity for the next 20 years, sign a contract, it is delivered. It's a very structured and well-respected mechanism for proving that a facility is using renewable electricity. So it helps avoid the greenwashing claims. It helps avoid the double counting challenges that are exist in other spaces with different mechanisms. So
Hmm.
Vietnam's version of power purchase agreements for consumers has been a long time coming. I was involved in some of the earliest meetings in Hanoi in 2019. It's
Hmm.
this year that the first 2 agreements have been signed under that mechanism. One was for Foxconn and one was for Samsung, so giant electronics. But moving forward, it's hoped that smaller factories will also be able to take part. At the moment, the larger the factory, the more exciting it is for everyone, and the comparatively less paperwork there is for everyone. So at the moment, there's no garment factories in the running, but that should change. And yeah, it's exciting for how Vietnam can really demonstrate its green credentials, and that the decarbonization that is touted by government officials and by industry is actually real. So yeah, it's great.
And I know that one topic that always comes up when you're discussing, new sustainable technologies, especially when in industries that kind of have longstanding traditional methods of doing things. Cost is usually a top concern. How like what does this new system cost compared to our old coal-fired boilers, what have you? So this factory that you visited in northern Vietnam, I mean, we don't have to share like exact financials or anything, but what does the cost of a electrified steamer or boiler compare to an old-fashioned one?
Yeah, no, it's a good question. And I mean, yeah, coal has been cheap, still is cheap, and is everyone's favorite medium for generating steam affordably. So
Mm-hmm.
when you compare any alternate technology to coal, it looks expensive. And that's the same for electrification currently today. But because of this UNFCCC mandate, or commitment for no coal by 2030, that does at least change then the comparisons. So we don't have to compare alternate energies to coal, because coal is not an option,
Mm-hmm.
which helps with some of the calculations.
Mm-hmm.
Um, and so, the next cheapest option is often biomass, which struggles to have a single definition, and then it struggles even further when you try and define sustainable biomass.
Mm.
But the short answer is, if you're going to use biomass, it really needs to come from agricultural waste products, so rice husks or cashew shells or something that would be considered an actual waste product.
Mm.
And then burning that instead of coal has a lower environmental impact, and often doesn't need to change the technology. So a coal boiler can be modified to burn rice husks
Mm-hmm.
without really then needing new equipment. And then the other alternatives, are going electric or going with gas. And obviously, gas is not a low carbon energy, especially when you
Mm-hmm.
factor in its entire, extraction and transport. And locking a factory into another different type of fossil fuel is unlikely to help its long-term decarbonization targets. Also, Vietnam imports most of its gas at high prices, and so in other markets where there's domestic gas, coal is being replaced with gas. Turkey, for example. But thankfully in Vietnam, that isn't the case. And so it really then does position electric options as relatively affordable, or a cost that kind of is unavoidable for the factory. So is less of a discussion to be had. So this factory in northern Vietnam, it was a multi-million-dollar investment for
Mm-hmm.
these heat pumps, but with a return on investment that was manageable by the factory. So the initial cost was high, but because of its rooftop solar, because the way heat pumps recycle waste heat and turn that into energy very affordably, this project is not, I think, I don't have it in front of me, but let's say 5 years return on investment. So
Okay.
after 5 years, all of that initial cost will have been covered by the savings on the energy bill,
Mm-hmm.
meaning that this factory will then spend 15 years saving money and being zero carbon. So that is very positive maths for anyone looking at that. Obviously, some factories and some industries still find a 5-year ROI to be too scary,
Right.
and much prefer a 2 or 3-year return on investment. And that is where, AII, who I work with now, has grants available to support really interesting projects around the world to get it down to an ROI that is happy for everyone involved, and really then demonstrate that electrification, heat pumps, is the way of the future, and to avoid investing in gas or other technology that will have to be replaced itself at some point in the future. Another way that electricity and electrification of this process can be made affordable is where countries are able to benefit kind of off-peak energy prices. So Vietnam does have cheaper electricity at nighttime. And so if factories are able to install batteries, whether it's electric battery or a thermal battery, they can further lower their costs by charging everything that needs to be charged at nighttime and then using that during the day. So again, Vietnam stands up well. So Vietnam looks good on that front as well. Also, its electricity is very cheap for industry compared to some of its competitors. A Vietnamese factory is paying about 8 US cents a kilowatt hour. In Cambodia, it's 14 cents, for example. So all of these really do support, positive future for Vietnam's industry.
Yes, that's good to hear about. I mean, obviously, Vietnam does have a lot of advantages in many ways. So I'm curious about one, not disadvantage, but issues we've certainly talked a lot about over time. I mean, you mentioned how the grid is widespread here. I mean, it's basically universal. You go to the most remote corners of the country, people have electricity, which is great. But as we know, every dry season in the north at this point, there's concerns over electricity supply, especially in the north, when the reservoirs for hydro start to dry up. Usually EVN will kind of crank up the thermal power plants at that point. I know you said a lot of factories at this point have rooftop solar and can use battery storage, as you were just saying. But are there concerns about, where the electricity is coming from, or the kind of stability of supply as things electrify?
Yeah, no, we've talked about this for years, haven't we? The grid reliability is the challenge in Vietnam, especially in the north. And that isn't going to change in the next few years, I don't think, but at least it appears to be well understood now and talked about in public circles in a way that wasn't in the past. And getting those transmission lines connecting the overabundance of solar from the south further up the country is critical to this. And then finding ways for the north to better utilize, what it's got. And some of that is, better usage of behind the meter solar. So at the moment, most factories will have their roofs covered in solar, but if they're in an industrial zone, like, these solar connection might not be connected to each other. So a more logical and a better supportive system is to microgrid all of the roofs within an industrial zone into one solar system, for example. And that allows factories to talk to each other. And if someone's like, I really need a lot of power at 3 p.m., they can get it, and others can balance that spread of energy in a way that isn't possible today. And that would really help lower some of the stresses, especially in the high energy industrial zones that the north has. I think the offshore wind and the nearshore wind discussion continues in Vietnam. That would help the country dramatically. Wind power is reliable most of the year, most of the time, and even works at nighttime. So it really gives you that balance. You have all the solar during the day, wind at night, and battery storage to cover the two shoulders, your early mornings and your evenings. Vietnam really does have that potential to do this, but it involves the will to really prioritize it. And it seems that's coming. You keep reading about gas projects being cancelled. And if the energy demand remains the same and proposed gas projects are being cancelled, then something has to take its place. And clearly isn't going to be more coal, thankfully. And so hydro in the region is pretty much maxed out. And with the changing weather patterns, makes hydro a worse kind of long-term investment. So better utilization of solar and really getting that wind in. I think, there was a wind project signed in Laos last year where 100% of it's going into Vietnam, somewhere in the Central Highlands kind of area. And more of those can be done, purchasing wind from other countries, but really getting that, just the power to keep the grid reliable and to mean that you don't have to turn on emergency generators at the factory level or at the district level. And then making sure it's as green as possible, and then green that you can certify, whether it is through buying certificates or signing these long-term power purchase agreements, to really demonstrate that green electricity is what industry needs and wants. And all of that supports Vietnam's national ambitions to decarbonize. So they all go hand in hand, and it all happens through electricity.
Yeah, and that Lao project is certainly interesting. I know there's sometimes talk about importing more power from China as well, at least in times of sort of intense demand. Yeah, I mean, you and I both know that offshore wind has been under discussion for years now, with still to be determined on when that's going to happen, but I suppose it will sometime. But yeah, obviously lots to pay attention to there. So you've laid out all these real advantages that Vietnam has, and you've talked about this factory up north that is sort of bleeding edge, I guess, not just for Vietnam, but the world in terms of the garment sector. So where do you see electrification in this, tier 2 category you mentioned going here in the future?
Yes, this Vietnamese factory is the first that I'm aware of a dyeing facility being 100% electric, and 100% of that electricity then being certified renewable. And yeah, I hope, I trust it is the first of many, many to come. And yeah, Vietnam leading the way on this. So where do I see this moving forward? I think for smaller tier 2 factories such as this one, we already have a working example of what can be done. And I would love for more factories to take note and to see this and explore it themselves. And AII is here to support on that. For the larger factories, where the consumption of fuel to make water hot is dramatically higher, there isn't currently the technology to easily shift that to electric kind of instantly. So to do a like-for-like replacement in one go is mind-bogglingly challenging and very, very expensive. So I think within the next year or two, we'll see the introduction of heat pumps at more factories, but just slowly reducing the need for steam from other sources. One area of the factory might be able to be met with heat pumps and battery storage, and then slowly expanding that as the technology further develops and as factories have the confidence and can see in their own data and in their own bottom line that this stuff works. All of that then supported by the DPPA, meaning that any electricity that they're buying through the grid can be certified as renewable, meeting the targets of the brands that source from them, as well as Vietnam government's targets for large factories to decarbonize. And all of this is predicated on the need to remove coal by 2030. So if you're a factory working with H&M Group or Ralph Lauren or Decathlon or Adidas, a few of the bigger guys, you've already got rid of coal. You're already ahead of target. But for most others, they are still aiming on that 2030 timeline. And so that is what's driving all current focus at factories. How to find a different fuel source. And so examples such as this one from northern Vietnam really do shine a light on how electricity can be utilized in this space. You don't have to keep burning stuff to make hot water, like factories have been doing for decades, and this really then also ties into changing how the dyeing process is done, for example. So at the moment, similar to men throwing fuel into a metal box, some of the dyeing process really is boiling a big tub of dyes and hot water and throwing fabric in it, which again feels rather Victorian. And there are waterless dyeing innovations happening right now that replace that process with a range of different technologies, but ones that basically cut water energy use by 90%. And as soon as you're removing that need for so much steam and so much hot water, then the economics and the technical barriers to electrifying how that steam and hot water is made, it really does change positively. So fundamentally, modernizing parts of the garment sector to utilize new ideas, new technologies, and new processes, because for so long the industry has been driven by what works, what is reliable, and what will keep working, and what is going to stay this way indefinitely. And no one's at scale come along and do we need to do it like this? Can we do something else? And we're in that space right now, driven, I would argue, by this need to remove coal. So that is the single defining thing, and Vietnam is so well positioned for that.
Okay, so I think we can close. I'll let you.
Sorry, that's a very long answer.
No problem. I'll let you do a bit of self-promotion at the end here. So you've mentioned that AII, I think, has grants or support for factories. In case there's a factory owner listening by any chance, maybe just you want to briefly share a bit more about the support you offer and how they could learn more.
Sure, thank you. So yes, AII has supported the industry's decarbonization work for a number of years now, and has a renewed focus in Vietnam through me on really driving this. So many factories will have worked on some of our programs, Clean by Design or Carbon Leadership Program, where we help factories identify how to be more energy efficient or where they can find savings. And more recently, this has expanded into direct grants to support cutting edge electrification, decarbonization investments. So things like steam heat pumps, waterless dyeing, thermal energy storage. And yeah, these are grants that are designed to lower the return on investment down to a number that is the factory can be happy with. So all the information is on our website. Google for AII grants, and you'll find all of the actual details. And then we've also just launched a new tool as well, where it's the benchmarking tool. So factories can submit their data, energy consumption data, and their process level data, and then it shows kind of where your factory's energy use and emissions stack against similar factories with the similar processes globally. So it's a really interesting way to confirm your management's belief that you have a good factory, or to maybe highlight it's not as good as the factory might think it is, and really then allow everyone to dive in and find the solutions that are needed. So these are AII does a lot, but all of it's with the mandate of really supporting factories to decarbonize.
Okay. Well, I'll be sure to include the link in the show notes, because you never know what you're going to get Googling with their AI overview these days. Might just make something up.
Thanks, Wim.
Yeah. But Pete, thanks so much for coming on the show. Obviously, we as mentioned, we talk a lot in a non-podcast format, but good to hear more about the work you're doing in Vietnam, and always nice to see or hear about positive work being, or kind of, groundbreaking work being done in Vietnam in various sectors. So yeah, appreciate you taking some time to come on and talk.
No, thank you. It's been fun. I hope some of what I said was interesting. I can talk about this stuff for hours, as anyone who knows me can agree. But yeah, please reach out. I'm findable on LinkedIn or via the AII website, and happy to talk more on all of these projects. It is, as you say, Mike, exciting, both that any of this stuff is happening anywhere, but that it's happening in Vietnam, makes me happy as well. So great to be involved.
That's it for this episode of the Vietnam Weekly podcast. Thank you so much for listening, and please rate or review the show on your preferred podcast platform. I'll be back in your feed next week and then take a break for the September 2nd holiday.